Good.
Okay. This paper started out when I made a proposal for what paper I'd work on was the cognitive demands of work and the lengthening work life. And as I got into the paper, I've got a very rich set of data, which I'm really far from fully exploiting, but decided that I would just focus on basically one cognitively challenging part of work, which is dealing with computerization. And the computerization has been, labor economists have paid quite a bit of attention to this in the last decade or so, and it's been implicated as an important reason for the growing inequality of wages and a decline of middle skill and middle class jobs. Most influential work along these lines was done in a paper by Otter et al., not just Otter, and surveyed in a recent handbook chapter by Otter and Asimoglu. This paper examines the implications of computerization for decisions about work and retirement of older Americans using the HRS data. And I guess I'd just say that much of the work has really been on this has been trying to look at the implications for the overall occupational structure of the U.S. economy and for the relative wages of different types of workers. But there's been, to my knowledge, very little attention to the implications for at the end of the working life for retirement. So in this study, I study the original HRS cohort that was born 1931 to 41. The cohort was 51 to 61 years of age at entry in 1992. They're followed biannually, even-numbered years for the 18-year period from 1992 to 2007, or excuse me, 2010, when they were 69 to 79 years of age. So we really do have a cohort where you can study how long they work up to a pretty late age. I think it's only Ted Cruz that was thinking that age 80 was the right age for retirement. We won't quite get to his stage. HRS contains detailed information on three-digit occupations and in restricted data, and that's literally numbers of occupations in the hundreds. So they're really quite detailed. And in the public use sample, those are restricted data. The public use sample, there are 17 occupations in the public use sample. I'm going to be using the restricted data on the three digits. The other thing that I'm going to be using is the ONAT data, which has come into widespread use by labor economists recently, mostly applied to aggregate data, to data such as the CPS and so forth. The ONAT is a project longstanding by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which used to be called the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, and now it's called the ONAT. Now I'm forgetting what the acronym is for, but it basically characterizes in great detail what goes on with people who are in each one of these occupations. The HRS also contains a self-report of many occupational characteristics, and in this paper I'm only using the measure of computer intensity of the occupation from the ONET and average occupational wage based on CPS data at the three-digit level. Future versions of the paper will exploit more richer aspects of the data. So here's kind of a computerization during the lifetime of the HRS cohort. Notice the source is personal recollection. Laura may comment as a psychologist on whether there's any accuracy to this recollection, but I'm a member of that cohort, albeit I have to stress a very young member of that cohort. So when this cohort was 21 to 31 years of age, the digital computer was basically being invented. The mainframe was introduced when they were in 31 to 41. Mini computer came along when they were 41 to 51. Personal computer got introduced when they were 51 to 61. That seems too late. I think that's that's not right. The growth of the internet occurred in the 90s and 2000s, and of course we got smartphones and tablets and apps, and some of us recently visited Intel, where they told us things that are in the future, which are really frightening, and I won't frighten you with them. So the labor economists who've looked at this, is just for those of you who aren't, most of you have probably seen graphs like this, often attribute the spread of the wage distribution, which you can see between the 90th percentile, the 50th percentile, and the 10th percentile of the wage distribution is spread out enormously since 1964. And the explanation has typically been that the advances in technology have complemented the human capital of high-skilled persons and have failed to complement the human capital of low-skilled persons. This idea of skill bias technical change has acquired quite a bit more nuance by the recognition that, in fact, what's gone on in the occupational distribution, it's what's called or what's been referred to as a hollowing out. It's the growth rates of these middle-skilled things like sales and office administration, production, operators and laborers and so forth have actually gone down much more than people at the very unskilled level on the right, and there's been this dramatic growth on the left here of the highly skilled things. And David Otter and Levy and Murnane made this argument that said, well, what's really going on is the way in which computers have influenced skills differs by the kind of tasks that people do in the occupations that they have. So they introduced this idea of routinization. If I can write a computer program that would do what you used to do, then I can substitute for you. And computers, and so it's obvious, for example, when before the advent of computers, when people were adding up long columns of numbers, the computer came along and could add those columns of numbers far faster and easier and cheaper than a person. And so the people who did that job got displaced and they had to go do something else. Well, computers have been advancing very rapidly in speed, in memory capacity, and so on and so forth. So those things that can be routinized, and that the potential routinization has gotten much larger over time. The cost has gone very far down, and so the question is, if you're in an occupation where your job is to do something that could be substituted for that, you're going to be sort of pushed out. Conversely, people who are like the people in this room, the computer tends to complement their skills. We can all do a lot more, or I can do a lot more computation now than I could when I was younger, simply because the machinery is there and the software is there and the storage capacity is there and communication ability is there for me to do a lot more, even though I've gotten older and cognitively disabled. At the other end of the spectrum, there's the people down at the bottom of this picture. The people, computers can't replace the human skills in many non-routine tasks. I mean, robots are coming along that may, sweep the floors and do various other kinds of things, watch security and whatnot, but they aren't completely here yet. So theoretical considerations for work and retirement decisions. Well, technological change causes obsolescence of skills. If workers and their employers must continually invest in their skills to prevent skill erosion. And if you make the investments in acquiring the new skills to learn how to deal with the new computers and the new software and so on, then it actually pays you to work longer. There's an endogenous effect on the length of the working career. It would pay you to work longer in order to capture the returns from those investments. Conversely, if you don't invest, and your productivity is going to fall, and you're going to find either internal pressure or external pressure to leave the job or shift to another occupation. So as the time horizon for retirement comes closer, the present value of investment tends to decline, and at some point, investment fails to offset obsolescence and productivity begins to fall, and that would be sort of moving toward a retirement outcome. The effects of advances in computer technology differ depending on whether the computers are complements or substitutes for occupational tasks. If they're complements, advances increase your labor productivity. If substitutes, they decrease it. And so you might expect rather different implications for people depending on where they are in the skill distribution. The dependent variable that I'm going to be using is a very simple trichotomous work partially retired, fully retired variable. I'll show you a picture here, but basically I'm starting people out in 1992 as fully employed individuals and just following what happens to them over the next 18 years. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to dwell here. I don't think there are too many surprises, and I'll show you a picture later of what this looks like. The explanatory variables that I'm going to be using are computerization and cognition. A computerized occupation at baseline, and I'm going to ask from the ONET data, I'm going to find out how computerized is your occupation, and the scale has been constructed by my student and often co-author Peter Hudemet, who's been using this data for his PhD dissertation, not the HRS part, but the ONET part, and he is constructed following some work by Firpo and Lemieux and Fortin to construct this ONET variable. So bigger values of this variable mean you're an occupation that uses computers more intensively. There's a self-report in the HRS in 1992 as well that asked people whether they used computers all of the time, most of the time, some of the time, not at all. And I'll show you in a second the connection between these two measures. It's a fair size correlation, I think around 0.5 or 0.6 between the ONET and the self-report. The occupational wage at baseline is constructed from the CPS data. Cognition in 1992 is from a 27-point scale that includes memory and counting backwards, and is a scale that's been used in other work on using the HRS. So here's the self-report, and you can sort of see the two groups here are the people who, in red, use computers sometimes or never, and they're kind of smeared across the whole thing. You can see a big spike in the blue, or these are people who use computers sometimes or all of the time. And I think basically what's going on on the blues suggests that the people who are in computerized occupations, there's a set of occupations that were really quite concentrated there in high levels of use. The other people may be, in some sense, for example, the secretary who's in a place where, at a time when secretary, or in the ONET data where secretaries almost always use computers, somebody might work for somebody who's old-fashioned, does typing, dictation, and so forth. And so you could get mismatches between the self-reports and the occupational reports for that kind of reason. I've got a set of other control variables, which I'm not going to concentrate on. It's sort of the usual suspects of things like health and marital status and age at baseline. The marital status will turn out in education, the marital and log earnings at baseline. A couple of those will turn out to deserve a little bit of comment when I get here. The econometric framework I use is really simple. I use an ordered probit model with three outcomes. Work, partially retired, and completely retired. That means that a variable that has a positive coefficient and goes up would be associated with more likelihood of retirement and less likelihood of work. The partial and full retirement are competing risks, and conventional models treat competing risk as independent, which doesn't make any sense in this case. And so I go to the opposite extreme and assume that the error term has just one dimension, and that gives this ordered kind of framework. And repeated observations for an individual treated as a cluster, but I'm not modeling individual transitions in retirement status, so you really can think of this as a repeated cross-section. I use a common parameterization of age that's really just trying to capture this pattern that we all know about. There's spikes at age 62 and 65, and that age has a further effect. When you do this, this is what things look like with no covariance. So you can see that the probability of working from these guys who start out in this way sort of falls down, but there's still this tail out here toward 80 that are still working. The probability that they're fully retired is going like this. And then there's this amorphous stage that Nicole knows more about than I do of the partially retired, which is a mixture of people who are part-time, of people who maybe even full-time, but think of themselves as retired and a bunch of other things. So the analysis of work and retirement, these are sort of control variables, and I think I'm not going to say very much about them. I don't think that there are too many surprises, and I don't want to spend time on this. The computerized occupation at baseline. Well, here you can see this is the ZONET variable, and when I introduce it, it's got a positive coefficient and highly significant, which says that people who are in computerized occupations retire sooner than people who aren't. And if I said, well, maybe that's standing for something about wages, so you put in occupational wage, and that just pushes the coefficient to be bigger. The occupational wage tends to keep people in the labor force. The computerization, there's a correlation there's actually a fairly strong correlation between wages and computerization, and that accounts for the change there. So computer intensity promotes retirement. Being in a high-paying occupation has a positive effect on work, but it does not compensate for the negative effect in any over the range. I want to talk about male and female differences, and one of the things would be why to expect them. Females in computer-intensive occupations are concentrated in clerical and administrative jobs, particularly in this cohort. Remember, this is the HRS cohort of women who entered the labor force largely after they'd finished childbearing, largely without computer skills, and had to learn on the job. They're competing with younger tech-savvy younger cohorts that are coming in. And my guess is in many of these occupations that there's relatively little monetary payoff to maintain or improving skills as computer technology increases. Late career, middle-skilled males in computerized occupations face similar conditions to those I described for women. There's competition from younger, more tech-savvy people. There's computers substituting for the tasks that they do if they are in this kind of middle skill thing. But the late career, high-skilled males whose skills are complemented by advances in computer technology are less likely to be pushed into retirement. And in fact, for the reasons I gave, they might be induced to work longer. So let's look at a little bit of this. This is now the same. And I guess I want to just stress one other thing. There's a lot of occupational segregation by gender, particularly in these cohorts. So if I look at the males and the females, and I just kind of repeat the same regression that I used before, the most notable thing is you can see the female negative effect is pushing to retirement is like twice the size of the male effect. So women are really being pushed into retirement in these computerized things. Another thing that's worth noting, what's worth noting here is sign of the effect of being married at baseline is of opposite sign to for men and women. If we, oops, so then there's another one which I think I missed a slide here, or I didn't put it in. So let me explain this picture. So I went into more detail on the male-female difference, and essentially what I'm doing here is interacting coefficients on the ONET computerization variable by single year of age, from age 54, which is the year after the baseline, through age 70. And you see really quite a startlingly different set of patterns. Let's look at women first. These are the green line. Females basically have a very strong tendency to get out of the labor, be out of the labor market. That seems sort of invariant by age. Men, some men have this very even stronger incentive to get out of the labor force, but then the thing just drops at age 62. It's Social Security eligibility for Social Security claiming age. And then there's this rise here, but this is all insignificant. What I think is going on is that the men are really in two different groups, and one is sort of the guys who are being pushed out of the jobs that their younger competitors and newfangled technology is pushing them out of, and there's another group I think that is more or less invariant to this. They're not getting out of the labor force early, and they're these more high-skilled guys. That needs more investigation, and I haven't yet done it. And the conclusions are older workers and their employers face a choice between investing in to maintain or enhance their skills to prevent erosion of their human capital and reductions in productivity as the date of retirement approaches. They have stronger they have incentives to go out. The theory predicts workers in occupations with rapidly advancing technology will retire earlier. Computerization is a prime case of a ubiquitous, rapidly changing technology. And basically my results support this kind of more nuanced theory that Otter et al. And others in this, labor economists in this occupational area have been promoting. And I think I don't need to say anything more. It does seem possible that the retirement effects of computerization may decrease with new cohorts as this becomes a less novel technology that you could learn about earlier in your life and perhaps at school. On the other hand, the heavy cognitive demands of non-routinizable work may induce people to choose less demanding occupations and less demand for educational programs early in their life, and this seems to underlie the job polarization that's so much discussed in the recent labor economics literature. So let me stop there.
Got it all. Thank you very much. It's been really fun to think about these issues with Bob, and the variety of influences on work, from cognitive level and skill to selection effects and individual differences to the age interactions to motivation and sort of three-way interactions, four-way interactions with gender. There's certainly a lot of influences here, and it's going to be a lot of fun, I'm sure, for Bob going forward to tease them all apart, figure out what's most important. When John first asked me to be a discussant in this session, I just assumed this was the paper or this was the work anyway that Bob would be talking about, because it's work that has become quickly a classic in psychology. So I'm sure in economics you're familiar with this country comparison of cognitive function as a function really of the generosity of the retirement benefits. And we see that in those countries where people work longer, you have higher cognitive function. And in the area of psychology, this has gotten a lot of attention because there's a lot of interest in seeing if one can intervene in cognitive functioning with age, and if there's something that one might be able to do to reduce cognitive decline. If work will do that, that would be terrific news. So far, these kinds of interventions that people have been doing, these computer-based interventions, have been pretty discouraging. You get effects with training, lots of different kinds of interventions, and the training effects tend not to endure past training, and they tend not to generalize to other things. So you get better on a particular task, but it doesn't maintain. And so again, the appeal of work being able to help bend this curve, and this is the curve I'm talking about, sadly, the age-related curve in cognitive processing or processing capacity is intriguing. It would be great, because if the interventions work for a short term but then don't maintain after the intervention stops, if you keep working, you've got the intervention going. So it's sort of this beautiful kind of a solution. So this has gotten an awful lot of attention in psychology. Can I ask, this is not presenter mode on here, I just noticed. I forgot I wasn't looking at my notes, but if you can just click it on that would be great to have. So let me say a word about this decline. This is, I'm sure, well known to all of you, that the ability to process new, novel information, to learn and adapt to, thank you. You're welcome. To new situations seems to be degraded by age. And this is generally characterized by a kind of a slowing in cognitive processing and its subsequent ripple effects, and through a lot of other components of basic learning. This is by sort of lore and psychology and evidence that this decline is evident across gender, across race, across wealth, across socioeconomic status, education level. So you see lots of variability, of course, in individual differences, but the slope seems to be steady and downward, and that's long been considered kind of axiomatic, that this is the age-related decline, and that it's very hard to do anything about this. As I say, these interventions have been limited. Knowledge is not affected negatively by age. In fact, one's fund of knowledge tends to increase because people do continue to learn. So what one knows and one's ability to perform at work in a routinized task would be good, one would predict, by age. It would be novel situations, new learning, something like computerization and technologies may introduce that one would expect to see challenging. But well-practiced kinds of tasks do not show much decline with age. Now, I want to mention something. I'm not exactly sure even how it's relevant to this particular sort of conundrum of bidirectional influences. But there's some recent evidence that we've been significantly overestimating cognitive decline in healthy aging. These are findings that have been reported by David Bennett and his colleagues, and were recently replicated by Marilyn Albert and her colleagues at Johns Hopkins. So we've got two big longitudinal studies that suggest that there are two very different trajectories for individuals who are going to maintain their health as they get older, and those individuals who are going to develop dementia, Alzheimer's disease in particular. And if these findings bear out, the whole story of cognitive aging and normal age-related decline is just a completely different story. It looks like for people who are going to develop Alzheimer's disease, we see a much steeper decline in cognitive performance, cognitive functioning, much earlier in life than was previously expected. And that the really good news is that for normals, that is people who are not going to develop this disease, that slope, we've been talking about the slope that I just showed you, somewhere in between, but it really doesn't characterize either group. It looks like people who are going to develop this disease might be showing what we call prodromal signs of the disease early on. That's not even mild cognitive impairment, not symptoms of any kind, but they just perform at the lower end of the range, those individuals who will develop dementia, and we see this early on. I mention this in part because I think it's interesting and changing that story that I just presented to you, and I'm sure many of you have heard before about cognitive aging, but also because this is likely to have huge selection effects. So people dropping out of the workforce may occur much earlier in adulthood because of the cognitive impairment that we see there. And it's possible that the cognitive challenges we've been thinking of in older workers are not much, there's really not a lot of evidence for them. This is still a significant decline, but it's nothing to write home about as far as I'm concerned. So with that, in terms of cognition and the challenges of adapting to changing technologies, let me turn to motivation and say a word about that. I think motivation may in the end be more important in people's retirement decisions than cognitive ability, especially in normal adults. Economists think a lot about time horizons. Psychologists do too, in a slightly different way. This is socio-emotional selectivity theory described in this slide. It's a theory that my students and I have developed over the years, and it's grounded in the human ability to monitor time, not just clock time and calendar time, but lifetime. And according to the theory, goals change as a function of time horizons. So the theory addresses two basic constellations of goals that motivate a lot of behavior throughout life, throughout adulthood. One is a constellation of goals about learning and preparing for the future, taking risks, investing in new people, exploring. And the other set of goals is about emotional meaning, feeling good, engaging in work that really matters. According to this theory, in youth, and or when people perceive their time horizons as long and nebulous, people are in this collecting mode. Expanding horizons, learning, taking risks, even when there is a negative emotional consequence to that engagement. So you might take a very hard course, you might work very hard on learning a new technology because of the long-term payoff potentially when time horizons are long. But when time horizons grow shorter, people tend to favor emotional meaning and goals that lead to satisfaction. Theoretically, we argue that if the goal is about satisfaction, the goal is realized in its very pursuit. So if people spend time on projects and with people that they care about, they tend to have emotional benefits related to, we think, this kind of shift in time horizons. Early on, when we were developing this theory, we did several studies where we would compare age differences and preferences for different kinds of goals, and found that, as hypothesized, older people strongly preferred to engage in emotionally meaningful activities and goals and social interactions as compared to younger adults. Theoretically, we're saying it's time horizons, not age per se, and so we manipulated time horizons and asked younger and older people, again, what their preferences were, and we saw that we could move these preferences, so that if we said to younger people, imagine that you're about to move across country, you're going by yourself without family or friends, now choose among these goals, their goals look very much like those of older adults. And when we ask older adults to imagine that they just received a phone call from their physician who told them about a new medical advance that virtually ensured they live about 20 years longer than they anticipated, their preferences now look like younger adults. So we saw a lot of movement, or the ability to move these around with time horizons. And time horizons, as I say, seem to be more important than age. I mention this in part because we also collected some data about work and work goals, and what do you want to work on when you're older and younger, and or when the work is coming to an end versus has a long and expansive future, and you see similar effects. So when work is coming to an end, people are much more interested in working on emotionally satisfying, meaningful tasks, and less so on tasks about new learning. And again, I mention this because I think we may see differences in the type of work that people engage in that very well maps on to the kinds of findings that Bob just described. So if you were, for example, to take a group, just hypothetically, of academics and look at their productivity as a function of time horizons, that is, and this is actually by cohort. So if we look at productivity in 1979 to 81, this is a sample of Norwegian academics. You're seeing a decline in productivity as people are anticipating retirement. You remove this retirement expectation, and we now see older academics more invested, actually more productive than their younger counterparts. So there may be an interaction with the meaningfulness of work. I would argue that academic life tends to be meaningful, especially among those who are selected to stay in academics this long. It's cognitively engaging and stimulating, and people tend to identify very much with the work that they're doing. So this might be an example of where a type of a job where computerization is complementing, not replacing, where you'd see people become more productive. If instead the work that a worker is engaged in is something that's highly routinized, tends to be less emotionally meaningful, something that's heavily practiced, one would think it would have poor effects on cognition. That is, that it would be doing less to preserve cognitive functioning in the worker, but in terms of motivation, continuing to learn new technologies in order to do work that is relatively, let's say, uninspired, would be much less interesting. I thought the gender differences in this paper were really interesting because both by cognition and by time horizons, we wouldn't expect to see differences by gender. There's a lot of evidence for gender similarities and cognitive change with age, whether you're looking at Alzheimer's disease and that profile, or you're looking at normal cognitive functioning. And the work that we've done on time horizons and manipulating it shows very similar effects for males and for females. We don't see differences there. So why might you see these differences for females, and especially when you see females leaving the workforce in those positions that are highly computerized at much higher levels? And there were two thoughts that I had, and one is related to economics and just the kind of lures out of the workforce. That is, if you're female, and in this sample largely married, one could imagine women having the opportunity to claim on spousal benefits and to have more opportunities to leave if the work isn't satisfying. And so we could think of that as one reason why women might leave more rapidly than men. But the other reason, and this is a finding from a colleague of mine, Claude Steele, about stereotype threat. And it also made me think, when you think about new technologies coming into the workforce and having to constantly learn and adapt, and as Bob said, compete with savvy young workers who are more facile with technologies, that you might see older women performing more poorly even than one's ability would suggest. So in the stereotype threat work, what Steele and his colleagues do, is to recruit groups of males and females, if they're comparing males and females, by, say, SAT scores. So they're finding women and men who are comparably able in terms of abilities to perform on math tests. They give them a very challenging math test, and what they find is on the most difficult questions, you see this gender difference emerge. It's where men are performing much better than women on the tasks. All Steele does to eliminate those gender differences is to say, before they take the test, you know, a lot of these math tests show gender differences, this one doesn't. And the effect goes away. What Steele maintains is that women are disengaging from the task. Independent of whether they believe they can do the task, they know that they're a member of a group about which there is a stereotype, that they're not going to be able to perform. And so, in part, they're disengaging from the task. In part, it's because they're doing two tasks at the same time. They're defending their group, and they're working on the task. And he has shown this, not only between women and men in math, but between Asian males and European American males on math tests, where the Asian group stereotypically is more able. He's shown it with blacks and whites, and he can just sort of eliminate these differences or bring about these differences with these relatively simple instructions. So, do the cognitive demands of work affect working life? Bob's got clear evidence that there is a relationship here that they do. They likely interact as a function of cognitive ability, but also the nature of the work itself and the meaningfulness of the work, and would result in very different kinds of patterns of retirement. If work does affect cognition, and people are selecting into jobs by initial levels of cognitive ability, right? It begins to look like a model of the rich getting richer. That is, you have relatively high cognitive function, you go into a job that is cognitively stimulating, the cognitive stimulation helps to preserve cognitive function, those jobs tend to be more meaningful and people may be more likely to want to stay in them. So it could be that it's playing out in that way. And that jobs where individuals get better and better at the job, but then engage in repetitive, routinized activities that have less meaning associated with them would be much more likely to drop out of the market. So thank you very much for the opportunity to comment on this. Thank you.
When Laura said that older people like, what'd you say, emotionally satisfying, meaningful tasks, I thought, like organizing this conference.
Yes. And you did a wonderful job, and we're happy to be here.
Okay. Are there any questions? There should be questions. Henry. Right behind you.
I have a question for Laura. Did Steele try telling both sexes that they were the better performers and see what the relative performance was? In other words, lying both ways.
Mm-hmm. I think he has done that, and I think he moves them around, but I wouldn't swear to it, just because he's done almost every version of this possible. These are sort of unbelievable findings, right, when you see that they're just too easy, and so they as a consequence, they're the most replicated findings in social psychology, because people going in and try it and do it another way just because they don't believe it could possibly be true. So I think they've moved these around and looked at all sorts of controls.
This is more to Dr. Willis, a really great paper. I'm really interested in the connection you made between training and incentives to stay on the job, because clearly investments in this kind of human capital is more generalized human capital. Computerization is something that would require more time on the job if there's going to be a return to the employer. We know that training is one of the most variable of all human capital investments that firms make. It's one of the first to be cut during periods of economic downturn, and I would imagine that older workers may bear the brunt of those cuts more than younger workers in the downturn. So I'm just wondering if there's any opportunity here to measure the impact of the training component on this decision to retire in computerized environments. By looking at patterns across downturns during your cycle. And because you would think, the people would hold on to their jobs more during a downturn and delay retirement, but if the training is cut and the ability of them to generate a return on this is limited, they're more likely to opt out. I'm just curious if that's a possibility.
Am I still wired? Okay.
I think you still have them. You're still wired.
Okay, so yeah, that's a great question. I think in several respects. So let me just respond to about three different things. First of all, standard human capital theory has basically been built on the idea that the returns to investment are highest when you're young and they tend to decline as you age, and to a large extent people have assumed that not much training or not much investment is going on toward the end of the career. And I think in a world in which there's been rapid technical change, that just can't be true. It's got to be the case that even older workers are learning new things. Now, the point with respect to the downturn, actually, when I first began working on this paper, even before I decided I was going to concentrate on computerization, I did a little trend analysis of participation rates for the 1980 or 1992 cohort by age, and then the HRS keeps adding new cohorts, new 6-year cohort every 6 years. And so there were people who were the entry cohort of 1998, then 2004, and they enter at age 51 to 56, and then the final one has entered in 2010, and that's the last available wave of data right now. And if you look, it turns out that the cohort of 2004, the entry cohort of people in 2004, I looked at them in 2010, and these were people who were caught in the Great Recession at different ages. And by 2010, I guess they were 6 years older, so they were sort of the oldest members of that group were toward 62, and the youngest members were still in their 50s. And what you see is a very smooth line going for every other cohort with respect to age and continued participation in the labor force. And with the 2004 cohort, you see the people who were kind of well before Social Security claiming age worked more than would have been predicted by looking at the other cohorts at that age. And the people who were toward retirement age worked less. So it looked like there was this kind of change in the system. I thought originally that was going to be an interesting thing to investigate, but I later just thought, with respect to what I did here, it was basically a nuisance, because I couldn't really use that cohort in a kind of world that I was presenting that's more of a kind of steady state world. But I do think there's lessons to be learned by looking at the big experiment we had.
Other questions?
I think this might actually be a related question, but when you looked at people leaving the workforce, sort of correlated to their that top group and the middle group, did you split out involuntary versus voluntary retirement?
No, that's, I think, I'm actually, despite having headed the HRS for quite a long time, I've never really done very much retirement research, but so others who've done more can correct me, but my impression is that there's not a lot of stuff that, in terms of at least data from the HRS, that you can find that people were forced out. Would you agree with that, Mike? And just exactly what that means, I'm not sure. There are some questions. There's actually one of these there are a lot of questions about the workplace that are, as far as I know, have been fairly underused by researchers using the HRS, including a question about whether you feel pressure to retire. Do your co-workers want you to retire? and things like this. And I haven't looked at those to see whether they have much going on.
Those questions do actually have predictive power for retirement. There are questions like, does your employer discriminate against older workers and you feel pressure? They have predictive power for retirement, but the fraction of workers who affirm those practices is rather small, and
it could be self-justification.
It could be self-justification, but their numbers, like 15 to 20% would be the fractions that you see.